I've spent the last 2 months pulling apart one of the most overlooked decisions of the entire Vietnam War. Not a battle, not a weapon, a personnel policy. I started reading declassified rotation reports, Army testimony before Congress, after-action reviews from units on both sides of the wire. And the further I went, the angrier I got. Because what I found was this. The United States Army chose a rotation system that slowly destroyed itself from the inside. And just 60 miles away, a much smaller army, the Australians, chose differently. Same war, same enemy, same jungle, completely different results. And when you see the numbers side by side, you'll understand why one army held together and the other cracked apart. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. August 18, 1966. 108 Australian soldiers from D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, are walking into a rubber plantation near a village called Long Tan. The rain is coming down in sheets. Visibility is collapsing. And somewhere ahead, in the gray curtain between the rubber trees, more than 2,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army troops are waiting to spring the deadliest ambush the Australians will face in the entire war. What happens next will be studied for decades. But here's what stopped me cold when I first started researching this story. It wasn't the battle itself. It was what made the battle possible. Every single man in D Company had trained together back in Australia. They'd rehearsed contact drills together. They knew each other's voices, each other's habits, each other's breaking points. When the world exploded around them, they didn't fall apart. They fought as one organism. Now imagine a different scene. Same year, different province. An American infantry platoon on patrol. The point man has been in country 9 months. The man behind him arrived last Tuesday. Their platoon leader, a second lieutenant fresh from officer candidate school, has been in command for 11 days. The squad leader they trusted rotated home last Friday. Nobody told the new lieutenant about the trail junction where Charlie always plants mines. 2 armies, same war, same 12-month tours. But the way they structured those 12 months created 2 entirely different wars. One system kept men together, the other tore them apart. And I found evidence that senior American commanders knew it was happening and did nothing. What I uncovered in the records explains not just a policy failure, but the slow-motion collapse of the most powerful army on Earth. When I first started pulling the thread on this story, I assumed both armies simply did 12 months and went home. On the surface, it looked identical. Australian soldiers served 12-month tours in Vietnam. American soldiers served 12-month tours in Vietnam. The number was the same. So what could possibly be different? Everything. The difference wasn't how long they served. It was how they arrived and how they left. The United States Army used what they called the individual rotation system. Every soldier had a personal DEROS, date eligible for return from overseas. The day you stepped off the plane at Bien Hoa or Tan Son Nut, your 12-month clock started ticking. Exactly 365 days later. Not 366, not 364. You were gone. You came alone. You served your time. You left alone. The system was sometimes called 365 and a wake-up. Because soldiers counted every single day. And the wake-up was that final overnight flight home on the Freedom Bird. General William Westmoreland, the overall commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, defended this approach repeatedly. He argued it was good for morale, because soldiers always knew exactly when they were going home. General Harold K. Johnson, the Army Chief of Staff, told interviewers that the boost of individual morale that this policy gave warranted and merited the one-year policy. He insisted that soldiers need something to look forward to. Reading through those justifications, I kept thinking. These men genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. And on paper, the logic made sense. During World War II, American soldiers had served for the duration. No end date, no light at the end of the tunnel. The psychological toll was devastating. General Johnson, himself a survivor of the Bataan Death March and years in a Japanese prison camp, told an interviewer in 1973 that a man began to wear out after about 5 months. He just got to the point of exhaustion. So the thinking went, give them a finish line. Let them see the end. They'll fight harder because they know it's temporary. The Australians looked at the same problem and arrived at a completely different answer. They used unit rotation. Entire battalions trained together in Australia at Canungra, the jungle training center in Queensland, for months before deployment. Then the whole battalion shipped out together, fought together for 12 months, and came home together. When 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, finished its tour, it was replaced by 7th Battalion or 8th Battalion. The entire formation rotated as one. Individual casualties were replaced individually. That was unavoidable. But the core of every unit remained intact from the first day to the last. The men who patrolled together on day 1 were, for the most part, the same men patrolling together on day 300. This wasn't an accident. The Australians had learned something during the Malayan emergency in the 1950s, fighting communist insurgents in the jungles of what is now Malaysia alongside the British. They discovered that small unit cohesion, the bonds between the men who actually close with the enemy, was the single most important factor in counterinsurgency warfare. As one Australian veteran of the Quora military forums put it bluntly, we deployed as a trained unit as opposed to individual rotations that seemed to prevail in the U.S. Army. When I first read about this distinction, I thought, okay, that's an interesting footnote. Then I started looking at the consequences. And that's when the footnote became the whole story. Because the American DEROS system didn't just rotate individuals. It created an environment where units were constantly hemorrhaging experienced men and absorbing green replacements who knew nothing about the terrain, the enemy, or the men around them. It turned every infantry platoon into a revolving door, and it gave birth to a term that would come to define the American experience in Vietnam, a term no Australian unit ever needed. They called the new arrivals FNGs. The F stood for a word I won't say on this channel. The NG stood for new guy. To understand why America chose the DEROS system, you have to go back before Vietnam, back to Korea. During the Korean War, the U.S. military experimented with a points-based rotation system. Soldiers accumulated points based on time in combat, time in country, and proximity to danger. When you hit your number, you went home. The system was crude, but it worked well enough that when Vietnam came along, military planners refined it into something simpler. A flat 12 months for Army personnel, 13 months for Marines. The political reality was inescapable. Vietnam was not a declared war. It was fought largely with conscripts, young men pulled from civilian life through the draft, serving 2-year enlistments. Most draftees spent about 10 months training before deployment, which left roughly 12 months of useful service before their enlistment expired. The rotation policy wasn't designed around combat effectiveness. It was designed around the draft calendar. General Westmoreland himself acknowledged that the existing policy was politically impossible to change. But there was a deeper problem that I spent weeks trying to verify. The DEROS system didn't just rotate enlisted men every 12 months. It rotated officers even faster. Company commanders and platoon leaders typically served only 6 months in command before being moved to staff positions. The official justification was to give more officers combat experience. to spread the wealth across the officer corps. In practice, it meant that the men doing the fighting were led by a constantly changing parade of strangers. One American grunt's testimony, which I found cited in multiple sources, captures the absurdity perfectly. During my year in country, I had 5 second lieutenant platoon leaders and 4 company commanders. We were more experienced than any of them, yet they acted like little gods. The Australians arrived at their system through a very different institutional history. When the first Australian advisors, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, landed in Saigon on the August 3, 1962. They were a hand-picked group of 30 officers and senior NCOs, almost all of them veterans of the Malayan emergency. The average age was 35. These weren't conscripts counting days. They were career soldiers who understood jungle warfare at a cellular level. Colonel Ted Sarong, the AATTV's commander, had spent years studying communist insurgency methods. He understood that counterinsurgency is a patient war, a war of relationships, of understanding local populations, of knowing every trail and every village, elder by name. You can't do that if your personnel are cycling through like tourists. When Australia escalated its commitment in 1966, establishing the first Australian task force at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province, the decision to maintain unit rotation was deliberate and informed by bitter experience. The Australians had already tried it the American way. In 1965, the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had been attached to the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa. They operated under American command using American tactics: big sweeps, heavy firepower, body counts. The Australians hated it. They found the American approach to be the opposite of everything they'd learned in Malaya. According to one account from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, many officers believed that the tactics developed during the Malayan emergency and the Indonesian confrontation were better suited to the Vietnam campaign and less likely to lead to a politically unacceptable casualty rate. The experience of one RAR under American operational control convinced Canberra to demand its own area of operations and the freedom to fight its own way. That meant unit rotation. That meant battalions training together at Kanungra, deploying together to Nui Dat, operating together for 12 months, and then being replaced wholesale by the next battalion. All 9 battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment eventually rotated through one ATF between 1966 and 1971, each spending at least 1 full year in country. The contrast with American practice couldn't have been sharper. In a U.S. infantry company, the turnover was constant. Every month, a handful of men rotated home and a handful of replacements arrived. On any given day, a platoon might contain men with 11 months of experience fighting alongside men who'd arrived that morning. The experienced men didn't want to invest in relationships with new arrivals. Why bother, when one of them might be dead by Thursday and the other would rotate home by Christmas? The new arrivals felt isolated, terrified, and unwelcome. Lieutenant Colonel David Holmes, writing in Military Review after the war, didn't mince words. He asserted that the short tour policy undoubtedly contributed to the instances of mutiny, corruption, drug abuse, and fragging. The Australians, meanwhile, built something the Americans never could: institutional memory within a unit. When a company commander in one ATF gave an order, the men carrying it out had been training with him since Queensland. They knew his voice in the dark. They knew how he thought. They trusted him, not because of rank, but because of time. I kept coming back to one devastating comparison. In the Australian task force, an infantry company might change its commander once during a 12-month tour, usually due to promotion or rotation to a staff role. In a comparable American unit, a company might burn through 4 commanders in the same period. And the platoons below them might see 5 or 6 different leaders. This wasn't a marginal difference. This was a fundamentally different war. The moment I understood the true cost of the American DEROS system was when I started mapping the timeline of a single American infantry platoon against what was happening in Australian units during the same period. The divergence was staggering. Let me walk you through what the record shows. On the American side, the DEROS system created a phenomenon the troops called short-timers syndrome. As a soldier approached his rotation date, the last 30, 60, 90 days, he became progressively more reluctant to take risks. And can you blame him? He'd survived 11 months in the jungle. Home was so close he could taste it. The last thing he wanted was to die on some meaningless patrol 3 weeks before his freedom bird. But here's what made it truly corrosive. Short-timer syndrome wasn't just about one man. It was contagious. When the most experienced men in a platoon started pulling back, when the guys who knew the trails, who could read the jungle, who had survived a dozen ambushes, the entire unit's effectiveness collapsed. Veterans on the Quora military forums describe it vividly. As a soldier's DEROS date approached, he became risk-averse to the point of being nearly useless. And anything that might delay his departure, a disciplinary infraction, for instance, was regarded with absolute dread because being sent to Long Binh jail would freeze your countdown. Now contrast that with what was happening at Nui Dat. On June 6, 1969, soldiers of 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, fought the Battle of Binh, a fierce house-to-house engagement just 5 kilometers north of the Australian base. It was one of the most intense actions of the Australian War, involving close-quarter combat with infantry and Centurion tanks against a dug-in combined NVA and Viet Cong force. The result? 1 Australian killed, 107 enemy dead, 6 wounded, 8 captured. What made Binh possible wasn't superior firepower alone. It was that the men of 5 RAR had been operating together in Phuoc Tuy for months. They knew the ground. They knew each other. When the order came to assault through a village under fire, there was no hesitation, because trust had been built over time, not improvised on the spot. The American system, by contrast, produced its darkest consequence in a word that entered the military lexicon during Vietnam and has never left it: fragging. Fragging, the deliberate killing or attempted killing of officers and NCOs by their own enlisted men, usually with a fragmentation grenade, became an epidemic in the U.S. military in Vietnam. The documented numbers are almost beyond belief. According to historian Gwenter Louis, the Army recorded 126 fragging incidents in 1969, 271 in 1970, and 333 in 1971. Author George Lepre calculated that the total number of known and suspected incidents using explosives from 1969 to 1972 reached 904, with 99 deaths and hundreds of injuries. And those numbers only count explosives. The true toll, including shootings disguised as combat deaths, will never be known. When I first read those statistics, I had to put the file down and just sit for a while. 900 incidents of soldiers trying to murder their own leaders in 4 years. That's not an army with a discipline problem. That's an army tearing itself apart. The connection to the rotation system was direct. Fragging was rare in the early days of the war, when units still had some residual cohesion. It exploded after 1968, when the Tet Offensive shattered any remaining illusion that the war was being won. and the individual rotation system had been grinding away at unit bonds for years. The rapid cycling of officers, those 6-month command tours, meant that enlisted men were constantly being led by strangers. Officers arrived eager to make their mark, often pushing aggressive tactics that the men viewed as recklessly endangering their lives for the sake of a career-building body count. One company commander captured the enlisted man's fear perfectly. Soldiers dreaded getting stuck with a lieutenant who would want to carry out all kinds of crazy John Wayne tactics, who would use their lives in an effort to win the war single-handedly, win the big medal, and get his picture in the hometown paper. Captain Barry Steinberg, an Army judge who presided over fragging trials, described the practice as the troops' way of controlling officers, adding that it was deadly effective. He argued that once an officer was intimidated by a fragging threat, he became useless to the military. I found no comparable pattern in Australian records, not one. The Australians had their share of discipline problems. No army in a war zone is perfect. But the institutional memory of unit rotation, the fact that officers and men served together for the duration of the tour, created an entirely different dynamic. An Australian company commander didn't arrive as a stranger with something to prove. He arrived as someone the men had trained with for months. The more I mapped out these parallel experiences, the clearer the picture became. The DEROS system created a vicious cycle. New men arrived and were treated with suspicion. Experienced men withdrew psychologically as their date approached. Leaders cycled through too fast to earn trust. And the men on the ground responded with cynicism, drug use, and, in the worst cases, violence against their own officers. One academic thesis I found from Humboldt State University put it as bluntly as anything I've ever read. The U.S. Army in Vietnam disintegrated because of internal personnel turbulence created by far-reaching complications caused by loss of experienced soldiers due to rotation on completion of the fixed-length tour of duty. Disintegrated. That's the word a researcher used. Not struggled, not faced challenges. Disintegrated. What fascinated me as I dug deeper was that American commanders knew the system was failing, and they kept it anyway. By 1968, prominent military psychiatrists were warning that the individual replacement system was having catastrophic consequences on unit cohesion. When General Harold K. Johnson was called to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee, he was asked directly about the rotation policy. His response? "We have no intention of altering the length of tour in Vietnam." I spent days trying to understand why. The reasons, once you assemble them, form a damning picture of institutional paralysis. First, the draft. America's conscription laws created a rigid timeline. A draftee served 2 years total. By the time he completed basic training, advanced individual training, and deployment processing, he had roughly 12 months left. You couldn't extend tours without extending enlistments, and extending enlistments for draftees was, as Westmoreland admitted, politically impossible. Second, the officer promotion system. The 6-month command rotation existed because the Army wanted to expose as many officers as possible to combat experience. In the institutional culture of the 1960s Army, a combat command, even a short one, was the golden ticket for promotion. To keep officers in command for 12 months would mean fewer officers getting their ticket punched, which would create a bottleneck in the promotion pipeline. The system served the career interests of the officer corps at the direct expense of the men they commanded. Third, sheer scale. At its peak, the U.S. had over 500,000 personnel in Vietnam. Managing unit rotations at that scale, shipping entire divisions in and out simultaneously, would have been a logistical nightmare. Individual rotation was administratively simpler, even if it was tactically ruinous. The Australians never faced these constraints. Their peak strength in Vietnam was around 7,700 troops. They had a much smaller force to manage, which made unit rotation feasible. They also had a fundamentally different military culture shaped by the Malayan experience that prioritized small unit effectiveness over institutional careerism. When one ATF was established, the decision to maintain unit rotation wasn't even particularly controversial. It was simply how the Australian Army operated. But the advantages compounded over time in ways that went beyond simple cohesion. Because Australian battalions rotated as units, each new battalion inherited the institutional knowledge of the task force. The artillery stayed, the SAS detachment stayed, the logistic elements at Vung Tau stayed. When 5 RAR replaced 6 RAR, the incoming battalion could draw on established relationships with local Vietnamese authorities, existing intelligence networks, and the accumulated tactical knowledge of soldiers who had operated in Phuoc Tuy province for months. The Americans had no equivalent mechanism. Every individual replacement arrived cold. He didn't know the terrain. He didn't know the local population. He didn't know which trails were mined. He had to learn everything from scratch, if the men around him bothered to teach him at all. As one study from the Army's own Command and General Staff College acknowledged, the individual rotation system undermined the cohesion of U.S. forces in the field. The Vietnamese enemy noticed the difference, too. Australian veterans consistently report that the Viet Cong treated them with a different kind of respect than they showed American units. The Australians patrolled in smaller groups. They moved quietly. They used counterinsurgency tactics learned in Malaya. Patient, methodical, focused on denying the enemy freedom of movement rather than chasing body counts. A historical analysis from the ASPI noted that these methods made Australian troops more effective and more respected by their enemy, though impatient U.S. commanders sometimes criticized the Australians for not clearing areas quickly enough. That patience was a direct product of unit cohesion. When you trust the men around you, when you've trained with them, when you know their capabilities, you can afford to be patient. You can move slowly through the jungle because you know your point man reads terrain the same way you do. You can set an ambush and wait for hours because you trust the man beside you to stay awake and stay quiet. The American experience was the opposite. With constant personnel turnover, units defaulted to the simplest and most firepower-heavy tactics available. When you can't trust the skills of the men around you, you compensate with artillery, airstrikes, and massive sweeps. This approach inflicted enormous damage on the enemy and on civilians, but it never produced lasting security. The Americans would sweep through an area, declare it cleared, and move on. The Viet Cong would return within days. The Australians, operating with cohesive units in their own area of responsibility, took a different approach. They established a permanent presence. They patrolled relentlessly, keeping the enemy off balance. And it worked. By 1971, Phuoc Tuy province had been largely cleared of local VC forces. Highway 15, the main route through the province, was open to unescorted traffic, an achievement almost unheard of elsewhere in Vietnam. I want to be careful here. The Australian success in Phuoc Tuy was not solely attributable to unit rotation. The province was smaller and less strategically important than many American areas of operation. The enemy forces were less numerous. The Australian task force had certain advantages in terrain and mission that American divisions did not. But the evidence I assembled points overwhelmingly in one direction. The way you manage your people shapes the way you fight. And the way you fight determines whether you win or lose. By 1969 and 1970, the two systems had produced armies operating at fundamentally different levels of effectiveness, and the contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. The U.S. Army in Vietnam was experiencing what multiple sources describe as a crisis of discipline. Drug use was rampant. One study of returning soldiers found that roughly a fifth were addicted to narcotics. The fragging rate was accelerating. from one incident per 3,300 servicemen in 1969 to a peak of 1 per 572 in 1971. Entire units were refusing orders. The term combat refusal entered the military vocabulary. In May 1971, the Army in Vietnam took the extraordinary step of temporarily halting the issuance of grenades to nearly all units and soldiers, confiscating weapons, ammunition, and knives from American troops in a war zone. Think about that for a moment. The U.S. Army disarmed its own soldiers because it feared them more than it feared the enemy. Meanwhile, the Australians were at the peak of their effectiveness in Phuoc Tuy. In the Battle of Binh Ba in June 1969, the performance of 5 RAR demonstrated what a cohesive unit could achieve. All 9 RAR battalions rotated through one ATF between 1966 and 1971, each building on the work of its predecessor. The SAS detachment, operating deep in enemy territory, maintained extraordinary kill ratios through patrols that demanded absolute trust between team members, the kind of trust that comes only from long association. The numbers tell the story in the starkest possible terms. Over the entire course of the war, approximately 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam. Total Australian dead, 523. Total wounded, approximately 2,400. These are not negligible numbers. Every death was a tragedy. But they represent a casualty rate that reflects disciplined, cohesive operations conducted by units that held together under pressure. The American DEROS system, by contrast, didn't just cost lives on the battlefield. It cost lives in base camps, in rear areas, in the places soldiers were supposed to be safe. The 904 documented fragging incidents were only the tip of the iceberg. For every actual attack, there were countless threats, intimidations, and incidents that went unreported. The effect on leadership was devastating. Officers went armed in rear areas. They changed their sleeping arrangements. Some turned a blind eye to drug use and indiscipline rather than risk a grenade under their bunk. The U.S. Army tried to fix the problem without addressing the root cause. They restricted access to grenades. They conducted lockdowns and investigations. They implemented anti-drug programs. None of it worked because none of it addressed the fundamental issue. The individual rotation system had destroyed the bonds that hold an army together. After the war, the Army finally acknowledged the damage. In the 1980s, the service launched the cohort experiment, Cohesion, Operational Readiness, and Training, which attempted to implement unit-based manning similar to what the Australians had used in Vietnam. Soldiers would train together, deploy together, and serve together for an extended period. The program was eventually scaled back due to cost and complexity, but its very existence was an admission that the DEROS system had been catastrophically wrong. The academic literature I reviewed is unambiguous. George Shaw's thesis at Humboldt State University concluded that the Army in Vietnam was destroyed by loss of institutional memory and lack of unit cohesion. Low morale and the subsequent breakdown of normative military mission, values, and discipline were manifestations of the demands and complications created by the rapid personnel rotation structure. What struck me most about this research was the preventability of it all. The U.S. Army knew that unit cohesion mattered. The studies of World War II had proven it. The sociological literature was clear. Janowitz and Schills had demonstrated in the late 1940s that comradely ties between small combat units were the decisive factor in providing good morale and organizational effectiveness. The Army chose to ignore all of it, chose administrative convenience and career management over the lives of the men doing the fighting. When I started this research, I expected to find a story about 2 different tour policies. What I found instead was a story about 2 fundamentally different philosophies of war. and how one of them devoured the army that adopted it. The Australian system wasn't perfect. Unit rotation had its own drawbacks. When a new battalion arrived, everyone was unfamiliar with the area simultaneously, and there was always a learning curve. Individual replacements for casualties sometimes felt like outsiders in a tight-knit unit. And Australia's smaller commitment meant they never faced the logistical scale that made American planners default to individual rotation. But the evidence is overwhelming. The American DEROS system, born from good intentions, from the memory of World War II burnout, from the political realities of the draft, produced an army that slowly consumed itself. It gave soldiers a light at the end of the tunnel and then destroyed the bonds that might have helped them survive to reach it. It prioritized individual morale over collective effectiveness and got neither. The lessons went forward. When the U.S. military fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, it used unit rotation, deploying brigades and battalions as cohesive formations, rotating them in and out together. The fragging epidemic of Vietnam became virtually non-existent. Only 2 cases went to court-martial from the beginning of the Iraq War through 2008. The all-volunteer force helped, but the rotation model mattered enormously. I keep coming back to that rubber plantation at Long Tan. 108 Australians surrounded by 2,000 enemy troops, fighting through a monsoon. They held because they were more than individuals counting days. They were a unit. They knew each other. They trusted each other. And in the end, that made all the difference. The DEROS system gave American soldiers the one thing they wanted most: a date to go home. But it took away the one thing they needed most to get there alive: each other.